myself set up here. Oh, there we go. Hosea chapter 2, starting in verse 14, as you can see on the screen, is where we're going to be at. I suspect I am not the only man in this room who has experienced having a woman in your life, whether that is a wife or a mother or sister, grandmother, or someone who likes to watch the dreaded Hallmark movie, okay? And so what happens is, if you watch like 3 of these things, what you realize is that every Hallmark movie has the same general plot, okay? And that's fine and all, that's what they like to watch, go for it. But you realize you don't really have to watch it to figure out what's going to happen. And I guarantee you at some point near the end of the movie, let's say somewhere between like 75% to 90% of the way through the movie, there's going to be a point where the couple that is at the focus of this movie, because there's always a couple that's at the focus, right? The couple that's at the focus of this movie is going to have some type of tension, right? They've gone through this thing where they've been slowly being drawn to one another, and then something happens and they have a fight, or one of them's not who they said they were, or however it turns out to be. And there's some type of tension, and the romance is off. The relationship is going to be over, and the girl's going to go back to the big city, or whatever it is in that particular movie. And then you have that moment that's the feel-good moment where the guy or the girl does something desperate and romantic and goes out and pursues that other person, tries to rekindle that relationship. The girl goes back to her her New York City apartment, and she gets there and sits down, and there's a ring at the doorbell, and she goes and opens it, and there's the guy. He's flown to New York, something along those lines. He does something to go and pursue. I've seen a few of these, by the way. If y'all haven't figured it out by now, I've seen a couple of them. And I bring that up to start this. You probably think that's a very strange way to start a sermon here. I bring it up because, as I've mentioned before a couple times, the story of Hosea is very much a love story. It's a love story between Hosea and Gomer, but even more in depth, it is a love story between God and his people, and it is symbolized through that language. And when you get to Hosea chapter 2, verses 14 through 23 here, the second half of the chapter, what you have is you are at that point in the quote-unquote story where things have been severed, the relationship has been broken, and now one party is going to do that thing to go back and mend the relationship. And that party, of course, is not Israel really, it's actually God. It is God who is going to go out, and he's going to take the initiative. He's going to pursue his bride, that is Israel. And so that is what is happening in the background of Hosea chapter 2. Now start reading with me in verses 14 through 23. I want to read through all of this, and stick with me if you will, and then we will go back and make some observations about this, and then the lesson will be yours. Starting in verse 14, it says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. And in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Bel. For I will remove the names of the Bels from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by my name no more. And I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow and the sword and war from the land. And I will make you lie down in safety. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. and he shall say, you are my God. And so you see very much here, we're at that point, and we get in Hosea chapter 3, it's put forth even more, but we're at that point in the quote-unquote, I don't know if story is the right word, but in the story where there's going to be a mending of what is broken. And so what we see as we begin looking at this passage is we see, all right, I've messed up my clicker here in some way. All right. There we go. Okay. We see that God renews the marriage. In verse 14, he starts off and he says, therefore, behold, I will allure her. Isn't that an interesting picture to see in your mind? God says, I'm going to take her into the wilderness and I'm going to allure her. In other words, God is taking his bride, his nation aside, and he is going to do something. God is not, he wants the marriage renewed, but he's not going to sit back idly by, and just wait for the bride to come home. That's not all he's going to do. He says, no, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go to her. I'm going to allure her, to compel her and pursue her to come back into this relationship with me. That very much what is being presented here is a picture of what we might describe as wooing, right? That is what God is said to be doing with his nation, Israel. And think about that. Who is the one that has messed up, right? Now, a lot of times in the Hallmark movie, it is the person who messed up that goes and apologizes and woos back the other person. But in the story between God and his people, God has never messed up. God is always perfect. He never transgresses the covenant. He is always faithful to mankind. And so Israel has messed up. People sin, and yet God is the one who goes out to allure Israel back into a relationship with him. In Hosea chapter 2 and verse 2, earlier, it was a pleading of the children for the mother to come back. He says, plead with your mother because she's not even really my wife anymore. The way she's acted, it's not the woman that I married, quote unquote. She's not my wife. So the children are pleading for a comeback. But now it is the husband, it is God through the metaphor that raises his voice to compel back the bride. And it says at the end of that verse that he will speak tenderly to her. And that type of language a couple of times in the Bible is used in a romantic context. I think one of those is in Ruth, the book of Ruth. I want to say it's Ruth chapter 2, where Ruth is having a conversation with Boaz, and it says that Boaz spoke kindly or tenderly to her. If you're familiar with that, you understand the romantic interweaving of that story as well. So while earlier in the chapter, in the first half of chapter 2, you have the discipline of God, you have the punishment of God at the forefront. It's almost as if God is trying to bring back his people through that means. There's a sense of fear, a sense of discipline and punishment. And yet what we see here is we see God is not driving them back with fear anymore, but instead he is driving them back with kindness and with love. And he says in verse 15 that he will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. You see that? What is the valley of Achor? Well, in the book of Joshua, remember when the people of Israel, they go out and they're going to start conquering the promised land. And they go, and the first great victory is where? It's Jericho, right? And so they had a command from God, and it said, when you go in and you take Jericho, you don't take any of the spoil for yourself. But one person did. This guy named Achan, he went and he took some of the spoil and he hid it under the tent. And so then they say, we're going to go take Ai, smaller little place over here, but they lose. And people die in that battle. And then they have to go through the process of sorting out what has happened, and it's revealed that Achan has sinned when it comes to the spoils of Jericho. The place where all that happens, the valley of Achor. And the word Achor means trouble. Right? And that is why it is called that. If you go to Joshua chapter 7 and you read verses 24 through 26, you will see it says there that it's named the valley of Achor because of that incident. And so what is being said here is that God is taking a place, a situation of trouble, and he is taking that trouble and turning it into a place of hope for his people. Right? And God has the power and the ability to do that. Think about that literal valley of Achor. While it was a place of trouble, eventually it also served as a gateway to the rest of the promised land. It was also a place of hope for the future. And right now it is saying to Israel, even though these things are going to happen, you're going to be disciplined, you're going to be punished, everything that we read in the first half of chapter 2, even though this trouble is going to come upon you because of your sin, still I can provide hope for you for the future. And I will give you hope. The valley of Achor will become a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time that she came out of the land of Egypt. He's referring back to that moment when they came out, and the moment when the covenant is first established. Now, when does the nation of Israel become God's chosen people in the Old Testament? Really, we would say, I guess, that it starts with Abraham, right? But we know that his descendants go into captivity in Egypt for 400 years. And so they come out of Egypt, and then Moses goes up on the mountain and he gets the law. And at this moment, God then makes the covenant. And this is, in a sense, we might say this is the marriage ceremony between the nation of Israel and God. They go into a covenant relationship with one another. So God refers back to that, and he says, if you remember the feelings that you had in that moment, the commitment that you gave to honor the covenant, the love that you had for me in that very moment. Now, we know they weren't always faithful in the wilderness, but at that specific moment, remember the love that you had. He says, I can make it so that that love comes back again. We can have that renewal of love and commitment that we once had. Of course, God has always been committed, but he desires the commitment of Egypt. I thought about Revelation chapter 2 right here. You know, in the beginning of Revelation, you have the seven churches seven letters to seven churches in Asia. And one of them, the first one in chapter 2, I believe, is to the church in Ephesus. And in verse 4, you have God reminding Ephesus of this. He says, but this I have against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Right? They had, Ephesus had a lot of things going for it, but the problem that they had was the love that they once had, perhaps a combination of the love for fellow man and the love for God, wasn't what the love should be, or the love they had when they first made a commitment to the Lord, or at the beginning of their church there. I think we all go through these experiences where we have peaks and valleys in our faith. Right? We have times where our love for the Lord, it is really on fire. Like for whatever reason, we are at the peak of a mountain. Sometimes that's right after a person makes the decision to become a Christian. And they're just really on fire for the Lord. But after a while, there comes a point where, life happens and you dwindle down just a little bit from that mountain peak. Or sometimes it's you go to like a church retreat, or you go to a conference, or you go to church camp in the summer. That was always one for me. And your love for the Lord, it's kind of rekindled and it's really on fire. And it dwindles back down. And I wonder, as we sit here this evening, if God was looking at each one of us and he was looking at the state of the love that we have for him at this moment, would he be saying, I wish that love was the love that you had at first. I wish it was the love as in the days of your youth, that is your spiritual youth. And perhaps we need to evaluate that in each one of our own lives. And then in verses 16 and 17, what you have is, it shows the putting away of the other lovers, that is the idols of Israel. They are going to be set aside to the point that their names are no longer even in the mouth of the nation. You ever had something that was in your past and you had to address it? It needs to be addressed, but after it's addressed, you're just like, we're not going to talk about that anymore. The past is the past, and we're going to move forward from that. That is kind of the picture you get. And it said that those things will be removed from her mouth, never to be spoken of again. And it says, you will call me my husband, or Ishi or Ishai, I don't know how to pronounce it, to be transparent with you. And then my Baal might be Baali or Baali in your translation of the Bible, but those literally come out to my husband and my Baal. In other words, remember earlier in chapter 2, I know I'm calling back a lot to what we talked about last week, but it's important to remember that Israel had gotten to a point where they had forgotten who their true God was. They had forgotten the one who actually takes care of them, the God that provides for them on a daily and consistent basis. And they have said, it is my lovers, that it is these other gods who have provided these things for me. And God is now saying, when this happens, at the renewal of this marriage, you will not look to your Baals anymore, but you will call me your husband. You will say to me, my husband. And this is a point where I think we need to address this, okay? Really the theme of Hosea 2, verse 14 through 23 is reversal. Right? Throughout this section of Scripture, like if you're a note taker in your Bible, you might even write in the margin, reversal. Because everything that is said earlier in the chapter, God is coming back now and saying, everything that you messed up, Israel, everything that you broke because of your sin, I can make it right. I can mend it. That is, I can reverse the damage that has been done. And this is the first place that we see it. Remember in Hosea chapter 2, verse 2, he says, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. But now what does he say in verse 16? In that day declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. You see the renewal of the marriage. You will be my wife again, and I will be your husband. It's very much like what we might call today a vow renewal. And you know what I'm talking about when people, they've been married for 35 years, and they say, we're going to have this ceremony where we remind ourselves of the vows that we made at first, and we're going to take these vows again. We're just, the marriage isn't changing, they're already married, but we're going to renew that love and commitment that we have to one another again. And that is what God is doing with his people here. He says, let's renew that love and commitment that we had at first. So verses 19 and 20. In that passage, he says, I will betroth you to me forever. Betroth you to me forever, and in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love, in mercy, and in faithfulness. Notice how these descriptions are, for the most part, the exact opposite of everything the relationship has been up to this point in the story of Hosea. Right? The relationship, whether you're talking about God and Israel or you're talking about Hosea and Gomer, it has not been a relationship of justice and righteousness and faithfulness. It has been the opposite in many ways, and yet there's hope that this can be the relationship in the future. Notice what he says in the beginning of verse 19. I will betroth you to me forever. I want you to think for just a second which husband you would want to attach yourself to forever. Of course, I'm speaking metaphorically, spiritually speaking. All of us are going to be, figuratively, married to either God or this world. One or the other. And which one would you rather have this forever commitment to? Because the God that we see here, he is the type of husband who shows mercy. And the world might promise mercy, but the world, as a lot of you know, it turns out to be cruel. And it might promise justice, but often we look around in the world and what do we see? We see injustice. And we see vengeance rather than justice. The world is always going to let us down. You might think it's going to hold up its end of the bargain for a minute, but it doesn't. It falls short, but God has never let us down. He's never let his people down at all. And so I ask the question to each one of us, who would I rather give my heart to? The world or the God that we read about in the Bible, specifically here in the story of Hosea? And then he ends that verse in verse 20 with saying, and you shall know the Lord. And now that's not just a basic knowledge, that's an in-depth knowledge. That is, you will be in a personal, intimate relationship with the Lord. And that is what each one of us should want in our lives as well. So God, we see renewing the marriage in this passage. But we also see that God restores his provision. Earlier in chapter 2, God has basically said to the people, if you think that it was your other gods, the Baals, that have provided for you all the things you need in this world, I can take those things away. I'm the one who's always gave it to you. I can take back the grain, the wine, and the oil. I have the right to do that. But here we see God coming back. Remember, I said the theme of this is in many ways reversal. God comes back and says, I can restore that provision as well. Notice as we go through these things, all this is happening not because Israel has made some grand change in who they are fundamentally. All of it happens because of who God is. Because God desires this relationship with his people. Because he loves them. He wants what's best for them. We can't overlook that. Verse 18. And I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, and the creeping things on the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and the war from the land. And I will make you lie down in safety. Now, I said God restores his provision. What kind of provision do we see in this verse? We see here the provision of peace, provision of safety, right? For many years, God looked at the nation of Israel, and he looked at the southern kingdom of Judah, because we saw that in chapter 1, and said, they're sinful. They have in many ways walked away from me. But for a long time, he protected them. He did not allow them to be totally conquered, totally taken over, because he was putting his shield of protection around them. And here we get this symbolism of a time of true peace and prosperity that he can provide again. And he says, I can take away the sword, the bow. That is, there's not going to be war in the land. And the peace that he's talking about is a peace that is so prevalent that he looks at the animals and says, you're not even going to have conflict with the animals. Like, you don't have to worry about getting attacked by the animal. The beasts of the field, the birds of heaven, the creeping things on the ground, they can all lie down in safety as well. This type of language is used at different points in the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, to speak of the type of peace that we have in the Messiah, that is in Jesus Christ. This happens in Isaiah chapter 2, for instance. So we think about our lives individually, and while I can't relate specifically to the situation of the nation of Israel always, I can think about the world that I live in and think about the peace that is provided to us through Jesus Christ, the peace that surpasses all understanding. And I can relate to what God says here in verses 19 and in verse 18. And then if we go to verse 21 and 22. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. Now what is happening in these two verses? What is all this answering that is being talked about? Or your translation might say something like responding or hearing. Again, we have another case here of a reversal of what is spoken of in the first half of the chapter. So we go back to verse 9. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season. I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Remember, that's what we were discussing earlier. This is the point where God says, I will take back my provision from my people to show them that it was all along I who was providing for them, no one else. And so now what we have in verses 21 and 22 is this scene where the nation of Israel, and you have the word Jezreel there in verse 22, I believe it is. You have verse 22. And Jezreel here represents the entirety of the nation of Israel. It's for anyone who's an English nerd in there, here it's a case of synecdoche, where a part symbolizes the whole. So the nation of Jezreel, or the place of Jezreel, symbolizes the whole nation of Israel. So the nation is looking, and it is crying out to the grain, the wine, and the oil, basically saying, where is our provision? Grain, wine, and oil, where are you at? We need these things to survive. And then, of course, all this is figurative. The grain, the wine, and the oil, they cry out to the earth, because the earth is supposed to be the one that produces the grain, the wine, and the oil. And then the earth is crying out to the heavens, because the earth needs the rain and the sunlight from the heavens to produce those things. And then finally, the heavens, figuratively, are crying out to the Lord. And it is the Lord who, of course, answers that. And so the Lord answers the heavens, and he gives the rain. And the rain comes down on the earth, and the earth yields the grain, the wine, and the oil. And that people of Israel and in Jezreel, they have their answer in that moment. God is restoring his provision to his people. I don't know that. Look, it has been extremely dry here, right, for a while. We were talking about the rain earlier and how nice it was to actually see some rain. Imagine being in a situation, though, where you are literally being punished by God to the point where it's not raining at all, because he has said, I'm pulling away any hope of food that you have. I'm taking the provision that I've always given you away. You're going to be fighting for scraps. We see that several times in Scripture, and that seems to be the case here in these 2 chapters of Hosea. And so Israel looks back at her husband, and even when she didn't acknowledge that he was the provider, he was the provider. And now God says to her, don't worry, I'll take care of you again. And I wonder if we remember that. I wonder if we believe that God will do that for us in our lives. Do we believe he will take care of us? There's a song, I think it is entitled, God Will Take Care of You. And the lyrics go like this. Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. Beneath his wings of love abide, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day, or all the way. He will take care of you. I remember singing that song a lot growing up. I don't know that I've sang it much recently. But I wonder if we were to sing it tonight, not that we are, but if we were, could you sing that in truth and in sincerity? Would you mean those lyrics as they came out of your mouth? God will restore his provision, and we have a promise to us in the Bible that God will provide for us if we will seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Matthew 6:33. And then we're going to see finally that God reclaims his people. He reclaims his people. Verse 23. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. Now, I want you to remember the names of the 3 children. Remember, and maybe for those of you who weren't here, in Hosea chapter 1, Hosea goes and he marries Gomer, and they have these children. Some of them are Hosea's, or one of them seems to be, and the other 2 are not actually Hosea's children. But God commands him to give the children certain names, and these names represent certain things. And all 3 of those names are referenced here in the last verse of Hosea chapter 2. I want you to notice the contrast of what was said in chapter 1 versus what is said now at the end of chapter 2. In chapter 1, verse 4, look what it says. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel. Now, it might interest you to know Jezreel means God sows, or God scatters. Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. See what he said? I will put an end to this kingdom. But then you go over to 2:23, and he says, I will sow, God sows, Jezreel, I will sow her for myself in the land. Not that he put an end to the kingdom, I will reestablish this kingdom. I will sow her for myself. I will plant this nation in the land that I promised to her fathers. And then in 1:6, she conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name Lo Ruhamah, or no mercy, because I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel. But then you go to 2:23, and he says, and I will have mercy on no mercy, or Lo Ruhamah. And then in 1:9, he says, to the last child, the second son, And the Lord said, call his name, not my people, or lo ami, lo am I. Call him not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. But then, in verse 23, I will say to not my people, I will say to lo am I, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. Everything that was broken because of the sin of the nation of Israel in chapters 1 and 2, at the end of chapter 2, God is looking at Israel and saying, I can mend it all. I can restore this. I can, you might say, reconcile us one to another if you would have it to be this way. This is the point where we are at, the happy ending to the story. If you were watching the movie, this would be the point in the movie where everything is back together, and then you have, whatever scene ends the movie, and you can, rest peacefully knowing that it's happily ever after for the couple, right? And you can just imagine in their life that they live in bliss for the next 30 years, however it might go. This is the happily ever after moment of the story. The relationship was broken to the point where the wife had left the house. The children were pleading with the mother, come back. The things that you're doing are wrong. This marriage doesn't even really exist anymore. But God has come back and he has allured her. He has renewed the marriage. He has restored his provision to his wife, and he has reclaimed his people. And they can move forward in covenant with one another together. In many ways, God has got his family back together again, and that was the title of this lesson. I want us to see, as we close this out, how the message of Hosea, message of God really through Hosea to Israel, how it is relevant for us. God has sought for each one of us to reclaim us, to bring us into covenant with him, and to provide for all of our spiritual needs. And he has done that through Jesus Christ. I think about the things that Christ said while he was on the earth. Things like we studied this morning, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Aren't those tender words to you? Aren't those alluring words? Don't they draw you to the God who would do that? I think about Jesus alluring people to him, calling people to himself. Like Matthew chapter 11, 28 through 30. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We could go to a number of passages, but when we read what God has done for us, when we read the things that are written for us in God's Word, you can feel, you can see and read God alluring you back to himself, calling you back. Whether it's the case that I've never been in true relationship with him, or whether at one time maybe I was and I've walked away, much like the wife in the story of Hosea. Either way, God is there calling you back to him through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, last thing I'll say is, wherever your relationship with God is, whatever point you might be in the story of your relationship, there is a happily ever after, an eternal ever after, available to each one of us. I don't want us to miss it. I want us to reclaim that for ourselves as well. If there's anything you need to do tonight, Sean is going to lead us in an invitation song. If you need to mend that relationship in any way, God is waiting on you while together we stand and while we sing.